Hello, welcome to the 7th Annual Everett Koop Institute Distinguished Lecture. I'm really pleased to have the Rockefeller Center partnering with us on bringing Gary Taubes to talk to us about sugar. And I want to just say a little something about Everett Koop and the Koop Institute before I introduce Steve Woloshin, who will introduce the speaker. I teach a course to Dartmouth students, and I ask them if they've ever heard of Everett Koop, and almost none of them raise their hand now. But if I ask this audience, how many of you have heard of Everett Koop? Right? It's like everybody, right? So I don't have to say much about him except that he got his BA at Dartmouth at a really way before I was born, and he was surgeon-in-chief at Children's Hospital. He really is the father of pediatric surgery. He's the person that taught other surgeons how to operate on premature babies and to fix congenital problems that babies are born with. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan as the 13th U.S. Surgeon General and served from 82 to 89 through the Clinton administration. And he was the only Surgeon General to from my perspective, that really became a household name. He published the first Surgeon General guidelines on secondhand smoke. He worked a lot on tobacco, and he's the person that really introduced the American public to the AIDS epidemic. So he's a very important person in my life as a physician and many of our lives as people that lived through that era. The Everett Koop Institute is now kind of reshaping its mission. Our mission is built around the prevention of disease through research, education, and policy. And what we recognize is that diseases that we're not going to be able to cure modern chronic diseases by treating them exclusively in the hospital. We have to address the products that cause the diseases. And the products are tobacco, alcohol, energy-dense foods, and opiates and guns. And so we at the Institute want to focus on these products and the better regulation of these products so that people don't use them in ways that cause the diseases that are choking up our hospitals. So that's what we focus on, and part of that is this distinguished lecture series. And you'll see other people coming through here like Gary that'll be talking about the products that cause the chronic diseases. Without saying any more, I want to introduce Steve Woloshin, who's a physician at the Koop Institute. He's a general internist, one of my colleagues, and I have tremendous respect for him and his partner, Lisa Schwartz. And Steve will introduce Gary. Oh, I want to thank Joanne Needham, Anna Daci, Mejia, and Paula Therian for putting this whole thing together. They've done a terrific job.
Thank you, Jim. So I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker. Gary is one of my heroes, and I think he's just the perfect person to give the Koop lecture. Like Dr. Koop, he's fearless, he's dogged, and he's effective. Dr. Koop fundamentally changed how the public views smoking, and Gary's work is doing much the same about diet. I first came across Gary a long time ago, at the beginning of the century, through his New York Times Magazine cover story, Is It All a Big Fat Lie?, which exposed the shaky science behind the conventional wisdom, and I should add, national policy promoting a low-fat diet. And through that article and his subsequent work, he's really changed the debate about diet, weight, and health, from how many calories we eat to what kinds of calories we're eating. I met Gary for the first time about 10 years ago. He accepted my invitation to speak at the NIH Medicine in the Media workshop, which I helped run. And I wanted him to inspire other journalists to adopt his rigorous and critical approach to covering medical research. Now, as I've come to know Gary over time, what's impressed me most about him is that he's not satisfied with just reporting on science or pointing out the flaws and limitations in what we know. He wants to make things better. If we're going to have evidence-based food policy, we really need to have good evidence. And that's why he founded the Nutrition Science Institute, an independent nonprofit which funds a collaboration of scientists and researchers to design and conduct high-quality trials to answer fundamental questions that will inform food policy so that it's driven by science rather than belief or commercial interests. Gary is an award, wake up everybody. He's a sugar rush. Gary is an award-winning author and journalist. He graduated from Harvard, which, if you don't know, that's the Dartmouth of Massachusetts, with a degree in physics. And he's got master's degrees in engineering from Stanford and journalism from Columbia. And his work regularly appears in a host of important publications, including Science, The Atlantic Monthly, New York Times, Esquire, Slate, a host of others. But most importantly, he's here with us today, so please join me in welcoming Gary Taubes.
I just want to say, Steve forgot one thing. I actually met him before he invited me to speak at his course. He got me invited to give grand rounds at the medical school here. And I don't know if you remember, and he was formative in developing my speaking style because he said, you're going to be talking to doctors, so make it like you're talking, if you could get your dog to understand it, you'll be hitting the right level. And in the other talk I give, that's exact. Basically, I've been giving the same talk since I redesigned it for the grand rounds here. So, yeah, today I'm talking about the case against sugar. I'm a big fan of epigraphs, so my favorite part of writing any book is choosing the epigraphs to open chapters with. So I have to do this with talks too. So this starts with one from Peter Medawar, the Nobel laureate. Scientific theories begin, if you like, as stories, and the purpose of the critical or rectifying episode in scientific reasoning is precisely to find out whether or not those stories are stories about real life. So today I'm going to tell you a story about sugar. I am also going to explain why the critical or rectifying episode in scientific reasoning never happened. Okay, so what I'm telling you about sugar is going to be speculation and hypothesis. The title of the talk is A Case Against Sugar. The way I put it is I'm confident I could get an indictment. I don't think I could get a conviction because the science necessary to get a conviction has never been done. As I had been writing about and studying science, good science and bad science, for about 20 years when I came upon this line from Claude Bernard, who wrote what I think is the single best book on the scientific method and how to think critically, which was an introduction to experimental medicine in 1865. Claude Bernard was a great French physiologist. And he said, to have our first idea of things, we must see those things. To have an idea about a natural phenomenon, we must first of all observe it. All human knowledge is limited to working back from observed effects to their cause. And when he said that, he also pointed out that the absolutely critical to doing good science is to be unbiased enough to make good observations. And once you can make critically clear observations, then you knew what you were trying to explain. So what the effect that we're trying to explain here, the observed effect is worldwide epidemics of obesity and diabetes and chromic diseases. Those are diseases in which the speaker can't spell the word chronic and doesn't proofread his slides, despite having given this talk about 7 times. Okay, so any population, I'm going to get here later. Basically, any population in the world makes a transition from its traditional diet, whatever its traditional diet is, to eating a Western diet, living a Western lifestyle. And you see usually sooner, occasionally later, explosions in the prevalence of obesity and diabetes. That's what we're trying to explain. So the implications for personal diet and personal health are obvious, but what the effect we're trying to explain is that, and the thesis, the story is that caloric sweeteners, specifically sucrose, that's the white powdered sugar we put on are coffee, and high fructose corn syrup or high fructose syrups are the cause, okay? So then I'm going to start with the story, and the story is about Elliot Jocelyn. So Elliot Jocelyn was a young doctor trained at Harvard in the 1880s, 1890s, who by the 20th century, by the 1920s, became the leading diabetes specialist in the US. He was known as the god of diabetes among diabetes researchers. When he was just a young doctor, just out of medical school, in 1898, with Reginald Fitz, a pathologist at Harvard, he decided he was obsessed with diabetes. He had already treated a case. He had a relative with diabetes. He and Fitz went through the case records of Mass General Hospital, so the major Boston hospital back to 1824 when it was founded, to look at any case of diabetes they could find, hoping to establish learn something about how to treat this disease and what might be the cause. 48,000 inpatient records over 74 years. They went through them by hand. By the way, Mass General has all these records in their archives. So one of the things I did in the course of my research is I went back and I asked the archivist at Mass General to confirm Jocelyn's account, which they did. It's an amazing institution. So the question is, how many cases of diabetes did they find in the 48,000 inpatient records over 74 years? I'll give you a hint that's completely useless. Today, 1 in 11 Americans has diabetes. And in some medical systems, like the VA system, 1 in 4 patients have diabetes. So you might expect somewhere between, 4,800 and maybe 15,000 cases of diabetes. They found 172 of them. And what was interesting when they went through it is they saw this steady increase in diabetes prevalence. So among the patients, both the percentage of patients and the number of cases of diabetes went up with each passing year. And they commented on this. Basically, the number of cases from 1885 to 1898 equals the number of cases in all the years before that. And he said, it appears from this table that within the past 13 years, as many cases of diabetes were admitted to the hospitals in the previous 61 years. And the percent in the past 13 years in proportion to the total number of hospital entries has increased fourfold over that of the first 15 years. Here's the same slide from Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, which also has their records, inpatient records back to 1867, and they also have archivists, and you can just email them if you're doing a project like I was, and ask them for their diabetes in cases, and you could see the same trend beginning in 1867 through years up until 1910 or so. There were years where there were 0 cases of diabetes. So you're actually watching the diabetes epidemics begin in these inpatient records back in the 19th century. And one of the things you would want to do to understand the beginning of any epidemic or the cause of any epidemic is you want to go back to the roots. If it's Ebola, you want to go back to the area in Africa where the Ebola showed up. If it's Zika, you want to go to its roots. Here you can actually see its roots in the inpatient records in these hospitals from the period. Jocelyn didn't use the word epidemic to explain what he was seeing, though. He actually thought what he was seeing was a good thing. He thought it meant more patients with diabetes were taking themselves off to the hospitals to be treated by doctors. So it was a sort of diagnostic effect. In the 19th century, avoiding a doctor if you were sick wasn't a bad idea. So whether or not it was a good thing is questionable. But by 1920, Jocelyn was using the word, 1921, he was using the word epidemic to explain what he was seeing. He said in 1900, the death rate from diabetes in the registration area of the US was 10 per 100,000, and in 1915, 18 per 100,000. In the same period in Boston, it rose from 14 to 26 on the same basis. There are probably more than 500,000 diabetics in the United States, and he had seen the numbers from Mass General 80 years earlier where they were virtually, at least if they existed, they weren't showing up in the hospitals. And this is what this looked like in 1924 when Haven Emerson, who was head of the Department of Public Health in New York, he was at Columbia University, and Louise Larimore documented these changes in diabetes incidence from 1900 to 1921 in major American cities. And when they went back to the Civil War up to 1920, in some cases there were increases 15-fold in diabetes mortality. And again, this could always be a diagnostic effect that people are now putting diabetes, a disease they weren't aware of, on death certificates. It doesn't necessarily mean that the prevalence is increasing. But the numbers were stunning, and certainly Jocelyn and Emerson and Larimore thought that what they were seeing reflected really dramatic increases in diabetes. This is how Jocelyn put it in his 1921 article. There are entirely too many diabetic patients in the country. Statistics for the last 30 years show so great an increase in the number that unless this were in part explained by a better recognition of the disease, the outlook for the future would be startling. In this disease, he actually started off this article. He started off talking about a small area in Oxford, Massachusetts, which is a town he grew up on. And he said there was a street, there was a single block in which 4 of 7 adults in 3 houses had died from diabetes. And he said if this was any other disease, any chronic, any infectious disease, there would be health agencies and experts crawling all over it trying to figure out what the cause of the disease were. But because it was a chronic disease, nobody was interested. So he talks here about the outlook for the future, and I just want to now jump almost 100 years into the future and ask the question today, and we have 30 million Americans with diabetes, and the number is 1 in 11. And worldwide, according to the World Health Organization, diabetes numbers among adults has quadrupled since 1980, and the global prevalence has doubled since 1980. And Margaret Chan, when she gave this talk in October 2016 at the annual meeting of the National Academies of Sciences, called this a slow motion disaster. And what she said, which was even more interesting, she gave an estimate of the probability of keeping a bad situation from getting much worse. So she asked this question: what are the odds that public health organizations like her own are going to prevent the increase in diabetes and obesity that was overtaking the world? And her estimate of the possibility that they would do so was virtually 0, which I found fascinating, because imagine the head of the world's greatest public health organization basically predicting with complete and utter certainty that they were going to fail to control this epidemic. Not reverse it, but prevent it from getting worse. So this is the observation for which we need a cause, this dramatic increase. This is the same in the Navajo Indians and the Native Americans in the beginning in the early 1950s. You see the same chart in Japan beginning in the again, this chart begins around the 1940s. Here's the increase in the US according to the CDC since the early 1960s. This is a 700% increase in prevalence. I mean, the fact that this isn't a constant conversation about what's going on in this country and why, and I'll explain shortly why it isn't. But imagine any other chronic disease. Imagine this chart being the chart of, AIDS prevalence or lung cancer prevalence or pick your disease. I'm saying the exact same thing Jocelyn did 100 years ago, or 100 years ago. So similar patterns observed in the Inuit, First Nations people, Polynesians, Micronesians, Melanesians, Aboriginal populations in Australia and Maoris in New Zealand, populations throughout South America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and in short, effectively every population in the world after a transition to a Western diet and lifestyle. So some obvious questions. It's a pandemic. What's the cause of the pandemic? What's the environmental trigger, i.e. the agent? Okay, if this were AIDS, we want to identify the HIV virus. If it's Ebola, you want to identify the Ebola virus. If it's tuberculosis, if it's malaria, let's find the agent. It's not enough to say it's a Western diet and lifestyle, which is sort of the vector, or processed foods, which is another way to look at it, or ultra-processed foods, which are kind of the vector. But what's the actual agent? Because unless we can't identify the agent, we can't solve this problem. So what aspect of diet and or lifestyle is to blame? And here's some other obvious questions. Why aren't we doing everything we can possibly to find out? Why aren't we questioning our assumptions about this disease? Why is no one being held accountable other than the victims and maybe the food industry? Why are no heads rolling? Okay? Again, 700% increase in any other disease since the 1960s, and nobody gets fired? I could give this whole talk about obesity. I find diabetes an easier argument to make, although obesity plays into it, as you'll see shortly. And the National Academy Obesity Medicine Society every year gives awards for, meritorious research in obesity, and the obesity epidemic has also kept going up and up and up. In the world I come in, if you've failed to control a disease, you don't get awards. And I'm waiting for somebody who gets an award to say, don't give it to me, I would like to turn it down, we've clearly failed. So what's going on here? Why not? Why do we think? And the answer why nobody cares is we think we know the answer, okay? Type 2 diabetes is caused by obesity or excess fat accumulation, or it's exacerbated by obesity or excess fat accumulation. Excess fat accumulation is caused by overconsumption, eating too much or sedentary behavior, okay? That makes perfect sense, and diabetes epidemics are certainly associated with obesity epidemics, and we've had an obesity epidemic, and you could go to any of these countries in the world that have had diabetes epidemics, and obesity has increased as well. And childhood obesity has increased dramatically, and you don't need statistics. You only have to be old enough to remember when there was one obese child in a grade and not 20% of them obese. So the complication here is that we also see, so on one level, these diseases are seen as very simple. Diabetes is driven by obesity. Obesity is driven by eating too much, calories in over calories out, overconsumption. On the other hand, these are seen as complex multifactorial diseases. So you've got all these various activities, socioeconomic status, environment, physical inactivity, dietary trends, genetic factors. And by talking about it as a multifactorial complex problem, it somehow seems understandable that we failed. Okay, this problem is too big to solve, and there's too many things working together and too many things that have to change, and it's a perfect storm of explanations. Here's the complex. Okay, diabetes and obesity are multifactorial complex disorders, so other possible triggers. And here's my response to that. I actually got spanked for believing in Occam's razor by Jerome Grobman in the New Yorker, so I'm still a little sensitive about this. He said I use Occam's razor to prove that sugar is a problem, and I say I use Occam's razor because anyone who doesn't use Occam's razor to solve a problem is not thinking critically. Okay, that's an absolutely vital scientific tool, and if you start with the assumption that what you have is a multifactorial complex problem, you will never solve it. But if you start with the assumption that it's simple, and then you find your simple hypothesis can't explain what you're observing, and then you complicate it, eventually you get to a level of complexity that explains the problem. As Einstein said, or was paraphrased as saying, everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so the question then becomes, what's the simplest possible hypothesis? What is the agent of this disease? And the obvious question is, what about sugar? Okay, if we can't explain it with sugar, then we'll complicate it, or we'll reject sugar as a hypothesis, but we start with the simplest possible hypothesis, and that's sugar consumption, because one of the things with sugar consumption is as populations transition from their traditional diets to their Western diets and lifestyles, a lot of things change. Okay, they become more sedentary, they get more automated, mechanized lives, they tend to eat more processed foods in general, but the very first things that change is they get sugar and white flour basically traded to them from the West. I mean, Darwin, when he traveled around the world on the Beagle, they traveled around with barrels of sugar and flour that they traded to the natives wherever they went, and they watched the natives eat the sugar and dance all night long. And they thought, this is wonderful, they love us. So is it possible that sugar is the agent? And here's what happened to sugar consumption in the US, which is rather remarkable. So remember, we're dating the beginning of the diabetes epidemic to around the 1840s, 1850s. So in the Mass General records from 1824 through about 1865, they have many years where they have 0 cases of diabetes, 0. And then the rest of the years, 1 case, 2 cases, and then it starts turning up right around the 1880s. So around 1800, we were consuming about 5 pounds of sugar per capita. Back then, it was exclusively sugar cane. And by 1900, we were consuming about 90 pounds, about an 18-fold increase. And the beet sugar industry kicks in around the 1860s. And what's interesting is in 1800, there were none of the things we consume sugar in today really existed back then. You bought sugar in barrels at the general store. And that was it. So there was no candy, there was no sodas, there were no fruit juices, there were no ice creams. I mean, ice cream had come about, but it was a kind of rare treat for the wealthy that if somebody went to a party and they served ice cream, it made it into the newspapers. In the 1840s, the candy industry, the chocolate industry, and the ice cream industry all kick in. The 1880s, the soft drink industry kicks in with Coke. Actually, first Dr. Pepper, then Coca-Cola, then PepsiCo. By 1900, these are nationwide phenomena, and they're exploding, the soft drinks. So it's possible, at least they're at the scene of the crime, is the way I describe it when I discuss this. And they were always, the interesting thing is they were always considered the obvious suspect. So they were considered the prime suspect. Frederick Allen, who was the leading authority on diabetes in the United States pre-Joslin. Joslin took over once insulin was discovered, and he kind of pioneered insulin therapy. But in Allen's book in 1913 on diabetes, he said the consumption of sugar is undoubtedly increasing. It's generally recognized that diabetes is increasing. And to a considerable extent, its incidence is greatest among the races and the classes of society that consume the most sugar. So in 1907, the British Medical Association had a meeting, at their annual meeting of the BMA, they had a symposium on diabetes in the tropics, and it was basically about the rampant diabetes that was appearing in the wealthier classes in India, including the vegetarians. Sex, and the obvious culprit was, I mean, there were a lot of culprits being debated. Maybe it was the stress of a Western kind of lifestyle, and maybe it was a lack of physical activity. When you become a wealthier population, you're not out in the fields all day long. But the recurrent theme was maybe it's sugar. Emerson and Larimore, when they did their study in 1924, said the same thing. Sugar was the obvious suspect. You add sugar to a diet, sugar consumption goes up. During World War I, there's sugar rationing. Diabetes rates plummet in all the countries in which it's going up. And again, there are a lot of things are changing during wars, and a lot of things are rationed. So you can't lock it into sugar, but it's quite possible. This is from the Emerson Larimore report in 1924. And again, these are various, the US, the UK, and Paris, I think. And then you could see sugar coming. This is the dip during World War I in each population. Again, it's an association. It's a coincidence. It's circumstantial evidence. So by the mid-1920s, this was being debated heavily in the US, and sugar was a serious cause, and then it vanished. And one of the reasons it vanished is because medicine had a history of being very authoritarian. So there were certain individuals like Joslin who were seen as sort of the defining figures. They wrote the textbooks. And back then there would be one or maybe 2 or 3 textbooks on a subject. And you read whatever they said you believed if you were a doctor. And Joslin didn't like it. Joslin was considered the god of diabetes in the US. So one of the reasons he didn't like it is because the Japanese ate a lot of carbs. And they had very little diabetes. This has been a recurrent theme. So the Japanese clearly have a high carbohydrate diet, and Joslin didn't realize that carbohydrates, rice carbohydrates, are different than sugar carbohydrates. He was a wonderful doctor and a gift to the diabetics of America, but he was a lousy biochemist. So sugar, sucrose, is made up of a molecule of glucose combined with a molecule of fructose. So glucose is the stuff of starch and grains. When you eat rice, you digest it, you break it down into glucose, and that's what you're absorbing. And fructose is a sugar that makes sugar sweet. They're all sugars. Anything ending in OSE is a sugar. And it's fructose that makes sugar sweet. It's fructose that makes fruit sweet. Fruit has some sucrose and some fructose in it. But sucrose, white sugar, is 50%. It's a molecule of glucose bonded to a molecule of fructose. High fructose corn syrup, when it came in 1977, was 45% glucose and 55% fructose, and it was a level that happened to, when you consumed it in Coca-Cola and Pepsi, it tasted identical. That's why they stopped at 55-45. So that's beet and cane sugar. It's a combination. Joslin didn't just realize that. He didn't know. He thought it's all the same. The Japanese are eating carbs. They don't have diabetes. And meanwhile, there was a British authority named Harold Hemsworth, who was the god of diabetes in the UK. He went on to become the head of the Medical Research Council, and he was arguing the same thing. And Joslin and Hemsworth just cited each other, and they piggybacked on each other. They would each cite multiple papers from the other in their research, and the argument was it's not sugar. The problem was when you looked at sugar consumption in Japan versus diabetes, it actually tracked with the diabetes rates. So sugar was low, diabetes was low, there's sugar consumption during the same period. So that if they understood about sugar, they might have asked this question, is it possible that it was sugar? And they would not have been able to refute it from the evidence. The second problem was that sugar was valuable for hypoglycemic episodes caused by insulin. So once insulin came in 1921 and you start treating diabetics with insulin, it's very difficult to properly gauge the insulin dose, so you end up with hypoglycemic episodes. You want to give those people candy or orange juice to bail them out before they go into hypoglycemic shock, and Jocelyn knew that and Hemsworth knew that. So they thought if sugar's so valuable for diabetes, clearly can't be the cause, right? And then the third possibility was that most diabetes was caused by getting fat, which was caused by eating too much or exercising too little. And Jocelyn believed this as well. So as he put it, diabetes is largely a penalty of obesity, and the greater the obesity, the more likely is nature to enforce it. With an excess of fat, diabetes begins, and from an excess of fat, diabetics die. So why do we get fat? I have an entirely, the lecture I gave at the med school was Why We Get Fat. I wrote a book called Why We Get Fat. The conventional wisdom is obesity is an energy balance disorder caused by the overconsumption of calories. You guys probably believe this, a calorie is a calorie. So the influence that foods have on our weight is how much we eat. So we get fat because we eat too much or we exercise too little. And this is a conventional wisdom. In my sugar book, I have a chapter called The Gift That Keeps on Giving. And I'm going to explain why. So this is actually from expert testimony. A few years ago, the city of San Francisco passed a labeling law where they would label sugary beverages with skull and crossbones and a label that says these can contribute to obesity and diabetes. It's a pretty benign label because anything, if you believe that you get fat and diabetic because you eat too much, anything can contribute to obesity and diabetes. And their expert witness was the most notable nutritional epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health. And in his expert witness, he said, well, obesity arises as a result of an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended, creating an energy surplus and a state of positive energy balance, which in turn results in excess body weight over time. And so if you believe this, it means that the only way that sugar can be bad for you is if you consume too much of it. Because the way you get fat is by consuming an energy surplus. And they actually, the city of San Francisco lost in the circuit court because the circuit court said, if this is why sugar is bad for you, then we're penalizing it because people like it too much. And we can't do that. And in fact, there's Harvard research that shows that French fries are more fattening than sugar, but as Harvard nutritionists didn't think we have to label French fries because we don't eat quite as much of them as we do sugar, so we only have to label sugar, and the court wasn't having it, and I don't blame it. So here's the problem with that. Well, this is how the sugar industry took this caloric balance idea. So the sugar industry loved this, right? Because all it says is that the way you get fat isn't through the toxic nature, the unique nature of some of the macronutrients, but through how much you eat and exercise and how many calories you consume. So they could use this idea to advertise sugar as basically a weight reduction tool. Certainly sugar for energy, and remember 3 teaspoons contain fewer calories than your egg, which is, I love this kind of thinking. Like, how'd they pick 3 teaspoons? Well, because it has fewer calories than an egg. They could have said, and they have other ads comparing it to grapefruits once the grapefruit diet came in. If sugar is so fattening, how come so many kids are so thin? Well, the fact is you constantly take in more food than your body needs. You'll probably get fat. If you eat a balanced diet in moderation, you probably won't. And sugar in moderation has a place in a balanced diet. So this calorie in, calorie out energy balance idea, which has existed since the early 20th century, sort of the general hypothesis of obesity, made obesity all about calories. And that made obesity all about eating too much, not specifically about sugar, and then we have diabetes linked to obesity. So here's the problem with that logic. Well, this is still the sugar industry's take. So sugar is not the cause of obesity. Consuming more food than needed to maintain energy balance causes overweight and obesity if you eat more calories than you need. It's all about personal responsibility. It's nothing about sugar. If you're getting fat, you just eat less sugar, right? Or you exercise more. That's the whole Gatorade concept. Drink your Gatorade, work out. Look at what great shape LeBron James is in, and he drinks Gatorade. If you want to lose weight, you'll need to cut calories or increase your activity level. In other words, there are no bad foods, only bad behaviors. Okay, so what's the catch with this thinking? Makes no sense. Okay, it's a tautology. I'll give you an example. So here's that Harvard explanation. Obesity arises as a result of an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended, creating an energy surplus in a state of positive energy balance, which in turn results in excess body weight over time. Makes sense, right? I believed this when I wrote, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? What if we were talking about wealth? I was giving a lecture about wealth generation, and I said wealth arises as a result of a money imbalance between dollars earned and dollars spent, creating a money surplus in a state of positive money balance, which in turn results in excess wealth over time. Okay, the exactly logical equivalent. Have I told you anything you didn't know? Right? And would you continue to listen to what I have to say about money? If my advice to you for how to get rich and ensure your retirement was to make more money than you spent, okay? How about we were talking about climate change? Very important, critical subject. I said climate change arises as a result of a heat imbalance between energy entering the atmosphere and energy leaving it, creating a heat surplus in a state of positive heat balance, which in turn results in excess heat and climate change over time. It's also nonsense, right? Climate change is a heat trapping problem, but we know that more energy is entering the atmosphere than is leaving it. Do you know why we know that? Because the atmosphere is heating up. Okay, so when you say that it's the fact that the atmosphere is heating up means more energy is entering it than leaving it. The fact that somebody's getting wealthy means that they're taking in more money than they're spending. The fact that someone's getting fat means they're taking in more energy than they're expending, but in none of these cases are these causal explanations. These are tautologies. In these other areas, they don't have to be said. Economists don't discuss the money balance theory of wealth because it's a tautology and it's absurd. Climate change discussions aren't about the energy balance theory of climate change, despite the energy imbalance, because it actually directs attention away from what's actually causing the problem, which is in climate change, it's energy trapping in the atmosphere of certain wavelengths of light by very specific greenhouse gases. And the energy imbalance is just something that happens when you trap it. So if this kind of explanation is absurd for wealth and climate change, why is it accepted explanation for obesity? Well, it has been the accepted explanation for 100 years. And there's another catch with it. It's science circa 1870 to 1920. Okay, so one of the revelations in doing my research is something good scientists will tell you. Science moves forward when a new technology comes along to look at something in a new way. Okay, so if you look at something in a new way, a new wavelength of light or the electromagnetic spectrum in astronomy, you're going to see new things and you're going to learn new things. And that's when science moves forward. And the modern nutrition began in the late 1860s with the creation, let me see if I have a slide, I don't. The creation of room-sized calorimeters. These are devices that could measure the energy expended by dogs or humans. Since the mid-18th century, nutritionists could measure the caloric content of foods. And then beginning in the 1860s, they could actually measure the caloric expenditure of humans and dogs by putting them in these room-sized calorimeters. So now they can measure the calories into animals or humans and the calories expended, and they could start studying things like caloric balance at a period in time, the late 19th century, when the chemists and physicists were working out the laws of thermodynamics, all about energy transfer. So energy was on everyone's mind. And all the nutritionists were doing was studying energy in, energy out, vitamin and mineral content, fiber content, and vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases. And so by the early 19th century, you had a theory of obesity that was caused by energy in and energy out, because that's all they could study. They knew vitamins and minerals weren't related. So they ruled that out. And sugar became empty calories, empty of vitamins and minerals, calories, because that's what they were studying. The problem is it leaves out a century of post-1920 science. So in 1921, insulin is discovered. And the science of endocrinology, which is science of hormones, begins to emerge. Growth hormones discovered in that decade. But even endocrinology can't get that far because it takes a tool in order to measure hormones accurately in the bloodstream, and that isn't developed until 1960 with the radioimmunoassay by Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson. Yalow won the Nobel Prize for it. After Burson died, she got the Nobel Prize for revolutionizing the field of endocrinology. By the 1960s, you could actually measure the effect of different foods, not just caloric content, but on how it affected hormones and enzymes in your body that affected things like fat accumulation. But by that time, obesity, for 40 years, research has been thinking about obesity as an energy balance problem. The field was dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to figure out how to get obese people to change their behavior. My favorite example was to get men to eat less by having their wives to refuse to have sex with them. And if the men gained weight, no sex. Because it's clearly an eating behavior issue. It's a behavioral problem, and these people didn't even know anything about endocrinology. They didn't read the endocrinology journals, they didn't read the textbooks. So an entire field of medicine directly related to fat accumulation. Like everyone knew, I mean, the German and Austrian medical authorities knew that obesity had to be a hormonal defect because men and women fatten differently, right? If they fatten differently, then sex hormones are involved with fattening. You know, women go through menopause, they gain weight. When you read the endocrinology literature on menopause, it was about lack of estrogen secretion, the effect of estrogen on fat accumulation. When you read the obesity literature, it was about women not caring that much about how they looked anymore and sitting around playing cards all day long and sharing, snacks with their other women who are getting heavier. I mean, it was crazy. And it was all left out, and it's been left out ever since. So consuming sugar happens to have unique hormonal metabolic effects that favor fat accumulation and insulin dysregulation, which is what diabetes is. So this is how you could think of it. There's two different ways to look at it. Sugar is empty calories versus sugar is having this unique metabolic hormonal effect. So 100 calories of sugar, this I borrowed from Rob Lustig, who's he's a pediatric endocrinologist at UC San Francisco, who became the modern era sort of anti-sugar crusader. And he said 100 calories of sugar it's metabolized differently from 100 calories of glucose alone, which is metabolized differently from 100 calories of protein or 100 calories of fat, and the hormonal responses are entirely different. The fructose moiety, that's the chemical term, fructose moiety of sugar is metabolized in your liver primarily. And the glucose is metabolized in every cell in your body. So why would you expect them to have the same effect, and why would you expect the sort of hormonal enzymatic response to be the same? So by the 1960s, we had worked out, after Yalow and Burson came along, basically a whole world of science explaining fat metabolism in the human body, and it was all linked to the hormone insulin, which is insulin because obese have very high rates of diabetes, and diabetics have very high rates of insulin. And as Yalow and Burson put it, they gave the Banting lecture at the American Diabetes Association, 1965, the annual convention. They said insulin is the principal regulator of fat metabolism. And if you want to get fat out of fat cells, the primary way to do it, you have to lower insulin. It requires only the negative stimulants of insulin deficiency. So insulin drives fat accumulation in many different ways, and insulin is the hormone that's dysfunctional in type 2, in all diabetes, but in different ways. So in 1960s, 1970s, you had this period where the endocrinologists are working out the science of fat accumulation, but it's being ignored by the psychologists and the psychiatrists. The idea that dietary fat causes heart disease rose as a hypothesis beginning in the 1950s, and it started to come of age in the 1960s. It was in the paper. Researchers were doing tests to try and test it, and the idea was that dietary fat raises cholesterol. But simultaneously, other researchers were looking at the effect of sort of what's called metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance on heart disease risk as well. John Yudkin came along. John Yudkin was a leading British nutritionist. He founded the first dedicated nutrition department at a university in the UK. His work had been used, his postgraduate work had been used by Francois Jacob, leading to the work that won him the Nobel Prize in biology. He was a very smart guy. And they're asking a different question. So in the US, researchers led by Nancel Keys at the University of Minnesota start asking this question. They want to know, why is there so much heart disease in the United States? So let me ask you a question. How many of you read Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman? Great book. Reading that, I understood what people said about my first book, which like very thought-provoking, could have been 200 pages shorter. He had a concept called what you see is all there is, YCAD, which to me is the most. So if you're in the US and you're a doctor and you're treating heart disease and you're looking at heart disease rates in the US, what you want to understand is heart disease rates in the United States. Okay, very important question. And the hypothesis they come up with is saturated fat, because we eat high-fat diets here. So first it's total fat, then it's saturated fat, and it elevates cholesterol, and that causes heart disease. But if you're in the US or the UK, you've got missionary and colony hospitals all around the world. And in those hospitals all around the world, people are seeing a different phenomenon. They're seeing this obesity, diabetes epidemics emerge, hypertension emerge, and heart disease emerge, and gout, and cancer. This whole cluster of chronic diseases, basically metabolic syndrome, insulin-related clusters. So they want to know what's the explanation for that, because they see something different, and they're seeing more of the world. And Yudkin, beginning in the 1960s, writes, if we're looking for dietary causes, some of the ills of civilization, they start talking about this idea of diseases of civilization. They later refer to it as diseases of Western diets, or Western diseases. We should look at the most significant changes in the man's diet, and the most significant change was sugar. Sugar had exploded in Western diets. Again, it's the same thing that Emerson and Larimore said, the same thing that Allen said. So national levels of consumption of fat and of sugar are closely similar, but statistics relating fat intake to heart disease or diabetes in different populations may therefore express only an indirect relationship. The causal relationship may be with sugar. And then he started talking about the effect of sugar on hormones and enzymes, and he did a whole series of experiments with students and with animals, basically demonstrating that sugar consumption could cause all the various metabolic symptoms that go along with insulin resistance and this cluster of metabolic diseases called Metabolic Syndrome. And by 1970, he was getting a lot of publicity. He wrote this book, Sweet and Deadly. I don't know, these people, they pick, well, I won't get into book titles. I don't like the title of my books. So what happened to this argument? By the 1970s, they're making progress. There's actually congressional hearings to discuss sugar in the diet and chronic diseases. And then in the 1970s, it evaporates. And it evaporated the same reason it did 40 years earlier when it was a diabetes argument, which was very specific nutritional authorities didn't like it. And the authoritarian sort of thinking in the medical community, if these people said something was bogus, it was bogus. And Nancel Keys didn't like it. And Nancel Keys was the leading nutritionist in the US, and he was a leading authority along with the leading proponent of the dietary fat dogma. And if dietary fat caused heart disease, then sugar couldn't. It's that simple. And if dietary fat was a problem with modern diets, then sugar couldn't be the problem with modern diets. And these two diets were irreconcilable. So Keys wrote an article, Sucrose in the Diet and Coronary Heart Disease, where he basically ridiculed Yudkin. And he first submitted this, he disseminated this as a letter to his friends, and then it got published in the journal. Let me see if here's some of the language used. The widely publicized theory that sucrose in the diet is a major factor in the development of coronary heart disease has been examined. The theory is not supported by acceptable clinical, epidemiological, theoretical, or experimental evidence. It has been claimed that the theory is supported by international statistics, by the time trend, by comparison of dietary habits of coronary patients and controls, and by experiments. Not one of these claims is justified by the actual evidence. And Yudkin was ridiculed. And in fact, by that time, Yudkin had retired from his position as head of the Department of Nutrition at, I always forget, King's College in London. And the administration had promised him a laboratory to work with, and they hired somebody to replace him who was a sort of Keys ally, and they didn't go through with the promise to give him a laboratory, and he ended up working at like the economics building and writing his books and slowly being ignored. The other problem is the sugar industry didn't like it. Okay? The sugar industry was justifiably averse to a hypothesis claiming sugar is the cause of modern chronic diseases. beginning in the 1960s, they put together a public relations campaign to fight back. And I don't blame them for this. In confronting Jack Tatum, who was the president of the Sugar Association Incorporated, that was the sugar industry's lobbying and research arm, said, in confronting our critics, we try never to lose sight of the fact that no confirmed scientific evidence links sugar to the death-dealing diseases. This crucial point is the lifeblood of the association. So what the sugar industry did is they basically, beginning in the 1970s, they put together a couple of seminars, symposiums, where they got experts together to discuss the science. And the experts actually said that what they should do, and including the consultants they hired, is they should test this idea. If even 15% of the public was sugar intolerant and getting metabolic syndrome, they didn't use that term at the time, but if even 15% of the public was getting this disorder, they had to know that. And they should spend any amount of money to study it. And the sugar industry didn't want, justifiably didn't want to do this. They saw people like Yudkin as fringe quacks. And in fact, it's fun, in the 1960s, Rodal, the founder of the organic food movement, wrote a book, an anti-sugar book, in which he blamed Hitler's final solution on Hitler's sweet tooth, and Napoleon on Napoleon's sweet tooth. And so it was easy to see these people as quacks. It wasn't that much of a leap to assume that they were all like Rodal. So instead of doing the studies, what the sugar industry did is it hired Fred Stair, who was the head of the Harvard Nutrition Department and had been a friend of the sugar industry since the founding of the department. The Harvard Sugar Nutrition Department had been founded in part with sugar industry money, and they'd funded it all along, and it wasn't a crime back then. Nutrition departments were actually founded to collaborate closely with industry. You know, they were going to generate nutritionists who were going to go off to work for industry, so it made perfect sense back then for industry to help fund these departments. It wasn't until Ralph Nader came along in the late 60s that this became seen as a kind of unholy alliance. But Stair was clearly a friend of the sugar industry. Stair liked to say that, yeah, it's true, he didn't eat pies because he didn't eat sugar because he liked to save his calories for his martinis, but it was all about calories. And so they hired Stair, who hired a group of researchers who are all anti-fat people, to write a report called Dietary Sugar, or Sugar in the Diet of Man. What's it called? Review. Sugar in the Diet of Man, that would basically argue that dietary fat was the issue and sugar was benign. And that's what they did. And at that time, the FDA was in the process of examining whether sugar should be considered generally recognized as safe as a food additive. And they had there was a committee put together by the FASB of the Experimental Biologist Society to look and see whether sugar should be generally recognized as safe. And this document, Sugar in the Diet of Man, was used heavily by them. And the FDA concluded that sugar is safe. And the sugar industry took this. Now this is Sugar is Safe. The Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, after a 4-year study, has concluded in a recent published report commissioned by the Food and Drug Administration that sugar at current levels of consumption is safe. That was a sort of general consensus. And it was a general consensus at the time because everyone believed that fat was the problem. In 1986, the FDA and FASB returned to this question. They put together a group of bureaucrats at the research administrators at the FDA to address whether sugar should be generally recognized as safe. And they came to pretty much the same conclusion. This is the language they had to use. No conclusive evidence on sugars demonstrates a hazard to the general public when sugars are consumed at the levels that are now current. And what was interesting about that conclusion is when sugars are consumed at the levels that are now current, so how much sugar were they consuming in the 1980s? So the FDA did its own assessment, threw out everything that the US Department of Agriculture had done, everything that the NIH had done over the years, and concluded that we were eating about 40 pounds per person per year. That's about a Coca-Cola per person per day. The USDA estimate at the time was 75 pounds per person per year. The USDA estimate for 2016 was 90 pounds per person per year. And when I say 131 pounds available, when you actually, the reliable number that we have for sugar consumption is sugar availability. That's how much sugar does the food industry make available for the food supply, how much is imported minus how much is exported. And that's a reliable number. And that number peaked in 1999 when I gave you the number of 90 pounds per capita at the end of the 19th century. That was a food availability number. It stayed relatively stable, went up to about 100, 110 pounds by the 1920s, and it stayed stable until the 1970s. And then we decided dietary fat was a cause of heart disease, and high fructose corn syrup entered the food supply, and we didn't know high fructose corn syrup was another form of sugar. And by 1999, that food availability number was 155 pounds per person per year. So that's about 4/10 of a pound of sugar per person per year. Out of that, you then estimate how much is thrown out, how much is fed to pets, how much is metabolized, is transformed in cooking or other chemical processes, and you get lower numbers. But one way or the other, by 2016, the USDA numbers, we were consuming more than twice as much as the FDA established in 1986 might be safe for consumption. Once the FDA did their job, a series of government reports followed. So by 1984, we had already also locked in this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. And a series of government reports, the Surgeon General's report, Nutrition and Health, this was C. Everett Koop's report, the National Academy of Sciences, Diet and Health, hammered on this idea that dietary fat is a problem. So we were told to avoid sugar. We were actually told by the first dietary guidelines to avoid eating too much sugar, which is about as benign a statement as you could make, because too much of anything is technically bad for you, right? It's another tautology, so you want to avoid doing too much of anything. But what happened in the 1980s is we developed this obsessive focus on the fat content of the diet. And chief among the food factors involved in overconsumption is a disproportionate consumption of foods high in fats, often at the expense of foods high in complex carbs. So our authorities are actually telling us to eat green vegetables and eat fruit and eat lean protein and eat fiber and avoid too much sugar. But the message was dietary fat caused heart disease and we should eat low-fat diets. And those of you who lived through that era remember when suddenly the idea of eating sour cream on your baked potato was like, you might as well just kill yourself. The baked potato was fine. Unintended consequences. There's always unintended consequences of any government report. Government action. So these are heart-healthy diet foods, okay? Yoplait, Greek calorie. It's only 100 calories. 0 grams of fat, 0 grams of saturated fat, low in salt. This is also 0 grams. This is a heart-healthy. The government actually went out and told the food industry to create foods like this. That's the heart-healthy part, and the 100 calories makes it a diet food. Not that much sugar, right? 7 grams of sugar, 12 grams of sugar. The 12 grams is 48% sugar. So you remove the fat from a food. Yogurt is a food. It's not a food-like substance, like Michael Pollan would say. You remove the fat. You now have this insipid, watery, low-fat thing. I mean, you could condense it down, but then you have smaller portions, so you want to keep the portion size large. So what you do is you add back fruit and high fructose corn syrup to make it taste good again, and now you have a heart-healthy diet food that's 48% sugar by calories. And this is what we've been eating. This is more than you hear about the Snackwell's effect. This happened to virtually every food, every processed food in America in some form. So what's changed since the late 1980s? Remember, so Yudkin is trying to explain this cluster of metabolic disorders that associate with obesity and diabetes in the 1960s. It doesn't really have a name back then. But by 1988, a Stanford University physician named Gerald Reaven calls it Syndrome X. And Syndrome X is excess weight, your waist size is getting bigger, you're glucose intolerant, so you're becoming diabetic, you have low HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, and high triglycerides, and high blood pressure. How many of you have high blood pressure in here? Okay, and how many of you, well, yeah, I won't get into it. So Reaven, who's been studying this since the 1960s at Stanford, puts this all together in Syndrome X. It became known as Metabolic Syndrome. It's technically insulin resistance syndrome. So insulin resistance is a condition where your cells in your body are resistant to the hormone insulin, and you have to secrete more insulin to do the same job. And so you're insulin resistant. It got the name metabolic syndrome instead of insulin resistance because it's hard to measure insulin resistance directly in a physician's office. So when the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute started discussing this, they didn't want to discuss it as insulin resistance syndrome because they couldn't tell doctors to measure insulin resistance. You could get HDL and triglycerides and blood pressure and waist circumference and glucose tolerance measured in an easy trip to the doctor. So they called it metabolic syndrome. It's associated with obesity because it's associated with getting fatter as part of metabolic syndrome, and it's associated with type 2 diabetes because glucose intolerance is part of type 2 diabetes is part of metabolic syndrome. It increases the risk of developing heart disease. It affects 1 in 5 people. Wikipedia is my ironclad source on this. And some studies estimate the prevalence in the US to be up to 25% of the population. It's not just 25%. The older you get, the more likely you are to have it. So by the time you're in your 50s and 60s, roughly half of all adults in America have it, and it's getting worse. And if you're overweight, if you're diabetic, you went through insulin resistance. And the truth is, if you get heart disease, you're not going to get heart disease because you had high LDL cholesterol. For most of us, or some huge proportion, it's going to be because we had metabolic syndrome. And what's interesting is even go back in the research to when Ansel Keys started studying the effect of saturated fat on cholesterol, they were concerned with what they saw as an epidemic of heart disease in overweight executives. So Keys, who was a little bit lacked just a tiny bit of confidence about the cholesterol heart disease thing, thought if nothing else, people with less fat, they'll lose weight. And he would say things like if those fatties would only stay away from the fat, they would lose weight. Even Keys was looking at metabolic syndrome. He just wasn't recognizing it as such. So the question is, what causes metabolic syndrome, or what causes insulin resistance? Because now we can look at those epidemics of obesity and diabetes as, in effect, epidemics of insulin resistance worldwide. And heart disease, it's associated with heart disease, with hypertension. And the conventional wisdom is sedentary behavior and maybe eating too much. The reason it's sedentary behavior is because a lot of thin people have metabolic syndrome, so you can't blame eating too much if they're thin, so we say sedentary behavior. And the biochemical wisdom is sugar, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup. So this was a review article done in 2010 by Luke Tappy, who's the world's leading authority on fructose metabolism. He also, I have heard, and I hope I'm right about this, Luke, gets some funding from Coca-Cola. So you would expect him to go easy on sugar as a possible cause. But as he said in this article, high fructose intake has indeed been shown to cause dyslipidemia and to impair hepatic insulin sensitivity. Although there's compelling evidence that very high fructose intake can have deleterious metabolic effects in humans as in rodents, the role of fructose in the development of the current epidemic of metabolic disorders remains controversial. And this is how it would happen if it happened. So fructose consumption, metabolic syndrome is, as I said, it's associated with low triglycerides, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and also small, dense LDL particles, or a high number of LDL particles. And that's technically known as dyslipidemia or atherogenic dyslipidemia. So there's various mechanisms, reactive oxygen species. When you take antioxidants, it's to, in theory, combat reactive oxidant species. Hyperuricemia is the condition that leads to gout, which leads to impaired vasodilation, which increases blood pressure. So these are all mechanisms by which fructose could lead to insulin resistance. And these are Tappy's mechanisms for how fructose can lead to obesity, insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure. So the point is, again, I told you this is a story that starts in the 1880s with, the 1840s with the increased sugar consumption and the beginning of diabetes and obesity. So there are caveats. It's controversial. I just said I think I can get an indictment. I can't get a conviction. Studies of sugar are primarily in animals, and animals aren't humans. I spend about half my life exaggerating, looking at articles in the paper and adding, it says doing X causes Y, and I want to say doing X in rats causes Y in rats, because you have no idea what it'll do in humans. Studies in humans tended to be a fructose alone. So it's a complicated studying these things in humans. And when you're studying, we don't eat fructose alone. We don't drink fructose alone. We drink it with sucrose, and the glucose stimulates insulin secretion while your liver is metabolizing fructose. And then the studies tend to last weeks to a few months, and you're looking at diseases that develop slowly over years to decades. So type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, they all develop, arguably over decades, but you can only afford to do the studies for 6 months, maximum a year. So the science is very ambiguous, and you can make an argument that you can't disassociate in the studies the effect of sugar from the effect of the calories in the sugar. So you can't prove that the gift that keeps on giving, this caloric balance hypothesis, was wrong. So meaningful studies are simply not being done. One of the reasons I co-founded this not-for-profit is to try and get them done. And to resolve the issue, the research has to be able to disassociate the metabolic hormonal effects of sugar from its calories. And it's surprisingly difficult to do, although it can be done if you put your mind to it. So the conclusion for the moment: sugar may well be the fundamental cause of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease via its effect on insulin resistance. And saying, as TAPI did, or the Institute of Medicine does, that there's a lack of scientific agreement, or that it's controversial, or that the science is unsettled, should not be compelling, should not be reassuring. We have a serious problem. We have these slow motion catastrophes, as Margaret Chan put it, and we have to establish the cause. I love this. This is my last issue. I think we have time. My wife calls this the Grinch that stole Christmas issue. That's right. If you're eating sugar and you're getting fat, or even the sugar industry would admit this, consume less sugar, right? But what about cancer? When I started my research, I would have thought clearly only a quack would link sugar to cancer, like Final Solution, Napoleon, cancer. What's interesting, so obesity and diabetes, this is from a Nature article in 2006. As I said, they're linked to a whole host of these metabolic diseases and metabolic syndrome, so insulin resistance at the heart of it, and type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. We have an epidemic of fatty liver disease, which is interesting. Children in this country have fatty liver disease. It could be another catastrophe in the making, and you might consider sugar a suspect because the fructose component of sugar is metabolized in the liver and it's converted into fat. Heart disease, hypertension, cancer is part of this metabolic disease cluster. It's interesting, when you go back into the history and you look at the emergence of these Western diseases in the history, cancer was one of the diseases that emerges in these populations. Cancer was always there, and you could find cancer in wild animals. But as populations become westernized, cancer rates tend to explode also. The problem is Western doctor rates also tend to explode. So you have to be able to disassociate. It could possibly be that cancer rates are growing because there are more doctors there to diagnose cancer. And in traditional populations, they knew enough not to go to doctors if they had cancer. One of the first cases of cancer ever discovered in Western Africa was an epithelioma of the penis. And the surgeon happily removed it, and you might not want that to happen. So if you had cancer, you might just not go to the doctor. And they talked back in the early 19th century about cancer patients showing up, and then after the doctor talked about treatment, the patient would vanish back to the bush. But cancer is linked to metabolic syndrome. Obesity is associated with cancer, so the fatter you are, the more likely you are to get cancer. Diabetes is associated with cancer, type 2 diabetes particularly. It's known now to be linked to both insulin and an insulin-like hormone called insulin-like growth factor. And this is all part of a new there's a whole kind of slow paradigm and shift in cancer to look at it not as a genetic disease, but a metabolic disease. So cancers fundamentally change their metabolism when they become, cells change their metabolism when they become malignant and start growing out of control, and they start metabolizing blood sugar at massive rates, and they upregulate insulin receptors on their membranes so they could suck in sugar, and they upregulate insulin-like growth factor. And there's a series of very good people who now believe that basically insulin resistance drives cancers through a series of mechanisms. So insulin resistance makes insulin levels go up, which makes blood levels of this insulin-like growth factor binding protein go down, which makes insulin-like growth factor itself become more bioavailable, which drives metastasis in the target cells, and you end up with tumor development. And so the question is, whatever causes insulin resistance, whatever that question mark is going to increase cancer prevalence and cancer rates. And like I said, you could look through the literature from that observation of cancer rates developing in primitive populations that become westernized, through cancer rates climbing in Native American populations from the 1940s onward, despite the presence of Bureau of Indian Affairs physicians in these populations all along, to cancer rates climbing in Inuits dramatically. Breast cancer rates in Inuits went from virtually zero in the 1960s, close to similar to other ethnic groups. You also have situations like Japanese women in Japan have very low rates of breast cancer. They come to the US within 2 generations, their breast cancer rates are similar. So you've got something driving cancer rates that's diet and lifestyle dependent. And if you believe this particular science, it's whatever causes insulin resistance. Thank you.
Tell us about your diet, because you're very lean and healthy looking, sir.
I don't need a lot of sugar. This is how I describe it now. I'm one of these people who's convinced myself that bacon and butter are health foods, and I hope the hell I'm right. Okay? I experimented with, when I first started my research, actually for the New York Times Magazine article 20 years ago, an economist at MIT, we were talking about good science and bad science. I said I'd been working on this series of investigative pieces on dietary fat, and he said, oh, if you're studying dietary fat, you've got to do an Atkins diet as an experiment. He has a colleague at Wharton whose father lost 200 pounds on the diet, he told me, and he was Asian American. He said he basically gave up white rice and lost 40. So I went back to California where I lived, and I didn't have a wife or family at the time, and nobody would really care if I had a massive heart attack. And so I did the experiment and tried the diet, and it does what everyone says it does. I lost weight effortlessly, weirdly effortlessly. It's a fascinating phenomenon. I fell off it, and then by the time I was about a third of the way through the research for my first book, as I was understanding that basically that's a diet that lowers insulin. And that quote from Yalow and Burson, that if you want to get fat out of fat cells, what you need is basically the insulin deficiency, a low-carb, high-fat diet, a ketogenic diet. They're all fundamentally diets that lower insulin as low as they can go. And there's a school of thinking, of which I'm now one of the leaders, which is weird being a journalist, which is that the lower your blood sugar, the lower your insulin, the healthier you are. And so that's how I eat, and it's weird. I got butter in the bag that I'm taking back to California because there's Vermont Creamery butter is among the best in the world, and it's hard to get in Oakland. We've got.
Yeah, 2 quick questions, but you obviously have highlighted a lot about insulin. I wonder, even if it's in rats and mice, if you have any comments on what sugars do to the other 50 or so orexigenic, anorexigenic peptides, and also what sugar does in epigenetics?
And the answer is no, I don't. So I look at the big picture. My brain doesn't do trees, it does forests. That's all I can say. That's why I had I was a B- student at Harvard. I'll cop to it. But let me put it this way. When those papers cross my desk, they never say good things. You know, I will skim them enough to see, is there something I should... There was an article in The Guardian or something lately about if you put sugar on wounds, it'll kill bacteria, maybe. But that's about the only good thing I've seen come out. But there's also there's selection bias in which once people start seeing something as bad, all they'll report as bad. So even if sugar was God's gift to humanity and our health, you might not see it once people like me start talking about how bad it is.
I will say this thing with sugar and wounds, that works. Good treatment for dogs with abscesses. It sucks the water out of the bacteria.
Well, I will keep it in mind because I now have a 9-year-old who plays basketball on concrete, so we'll probably get to. They're walking around with, okay.
Hi, so as an undergraduate student taking a statistics course, this is kind of on my mind. You talked about some of the difficulties with doing research, specifically long-term experiments, to really study the effects of sugar and to create that statement to be able to say it's a causation. So how do you and your nonprofit that you founded propose actually conducting these experiments to separate sugar from outside factors?
Okay, so it's interesting. One of the things we want to do is test this energy balance idea of obesity. So you could think of obesity as, on the one level, we have this idea it's caloric imbalance, and on the other level, it's basically the hormonal effect of the foods you're eating, and those hormones affect fat accumulation. Oh, so we have to disassociate somehow calories from macronutrients. So the way you would do it is you have to fix the calories that the people eat. So it means you basically have to lock them away somewhere. And then you have to feed them a specific amount of calories every day, depending on what you want to achieve with their body weight. And then you could manipulate the macronutrient composition in the groups that they're randomized to. So those are exceedingly expensive studies to do, because as soon as I say lock them away and feed them. So we did a pilot study of 17 subjects for 8 weeks. Wasn't even randomized. It was about $4.5 million. I would say that the experiment midway through, they learned why the methodology didn't work. And if it was a rat experiment, you'd have euthanized the rats and done it again. But because it was a human experiment and the $4.5 million one, even though we said we would try to raise another $4.5 million to do it right, the researchers weren't interested. We funded some studies. We have a study coming out. Actually, I have the paper waiting for me to read from a group at Harvard. There was a $12 million study doing a similar approach, not quite so locked in, so it's a little cheaper, but more subjects. That study should be out if it gets accepted within 2 months or so. While we were doing this, we decided to do a pilot study. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I said it used to be 20 years ago, if you were diagnosed with fatty liver disease and you told your doctor you didn't drink, your doctor would assume you were lying. And then fatty liver disease starts showing up in children who clearly aren't alcoholics. So now, like I said, it's epidemic. I think the estimate is something like 40 million kids might have it. It's particularly prevalent in the Hispanic population because they have a gene that predisposes them, and fructose is metabolized in the liver, so it makes perfect sense. So we put together a pilot study of sugar and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that was just about $1.5 million, and it's being done at UC San Diego and Emory. And 40 kids with diagnosed non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is a more severe version of it, and they would be randomized to 2 arms, and one arm would get a sugar-free diet. So we give their whole family 120% of the food they need, all of it prepared without any added sugar at all, and they're not drinking any sugar beverages. And the other, it's not a well-controlled trial, that's why it's a pilot study. The other family gets basically food card every week to go buy $200 worth of food. So they at least get some attention from us. That study was finished running subjects last May. Last December, the researchers were excited about the results and all anxious to publish them, and now we haven't heard from them in 2 months. So I have no idea what happened, but it looked, at least as of last December, that if it's not a well-controlled study. You could find, like for instance, if the fatty liver disease resolved, which is what would have explained their excitement, you might have said, well, it resolved because they lost weight. And it's likely the kids would lose weight because they wouldn't like the non-sugar food as much as they liked their original food, and they just ate less of it. So the sugar industry we're still not disassociating calories. And the reason we were doing this study was because we thought if we could show an effect in 4 weeks, we could take kids and put them in a summer camp where we could lock their calories, and now we could disassociate the effect of the sugar from the calories. This group at Harvard that has this paper coming out got $12 million from this foundation in Texas to do a follow-up study where they will possibly be able to disassociate the effect of sugar from other carbohydrates if it exists. So it's just thinking about how to, just like you would do an 8th grade science experiment, you want to minimize the variables that are changing, so we want to fix the calories they're eating or fix how much they weigh, if such a thing is possible, and then manipulate the macronutrient content or manipulate the sugar content.
Last question for the evening, and then Gary will be outside signing books, and Orange Bookstore is here. So last question.
Hi, I was wondering what your opinion is about products like Truvia.
Okay, I think there's 2 questions when it comes to artificial sweeteners. Are they safer than sugar? And are they safer than no sweeteners at all? So when it comes to are they safer than sugar, the science with the artificial sweeteners and Truvia and stevia and pick your artificial sweetener is as bad as the rest of the nutrition sciences for the most part. And it's very hard to do these studies because when you're doing sweeteners, you have trouble controlling for calories also. But sweeteners tend to be 100, 200, 300 times lower than sugar. So if you ask the question, is it safer than sugar? And this was something the head of the National Academy of Sciences pointed out in 1976 at a symposium. If you're getting 100 pounds of sugar a year, and you want the equivalent sweetness from, say, saccharin, which is 300 times as sweet as sugar, you'll take 1/3 of a pound of saccharin a year to get that sweetness, and I'm going to say that the 1/3 of a pound of saccharin is safer. It's been tested. The FDA wouldn't allow it as a short-term toxin, so we know it doesn't kill animals, and we know it doesn't give them cancer, even when given massive doses. So I'm going to assume that the artificial sweeteners are safer. Then the question is the artificial sweetener safer than no sweetener at all? And that's probably pretty easy. I can't imagine why no sweetener at all would be dangerous at all. But there is research coming out recently linking artificial sweeteners to diabetes and obesity. I don't find that very compelling. And sometimes I wonder if the sugar industry is very smartly funding it. But many people can't give up sugar. You tell them to give up sugar and not drink, not have something sweet, life loses its meaning. I understand that. I tried to give up coffee a few years ago, and no caffeine, wasn't worth getting out of bed for a year. So it's kind of a trade-off. I personally see, when I give advice, I see sweeteners as like a parachute, a crutch. Get off the sugar. If you have to have sweeteners, have sweeteners. I think Truvia, stevia are probably the best because they're naturally occurring. They've been consumed by Central American populations for hundreds of years with no apparent damage. They've been used in Japan for since the 40s or so. But ideally, you get rid of your sweet tooth.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.